Greetings, friends. Wanting Grizzly here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of December 16th through December 21st of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this a thumbs up, comment your thoughts. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, because we are going to be starting this update in the Sumy direction. We have not talked about Sumy in, like, months. I think, actually, it's been that long. But we now are talking about it because it's the front and center of this week's week, because the Russians have opened a new front in the Sumy direction. It began with reports a few days ago that the Russians took the small village of the town of Vostok here. I wouldn't be surprised if they also took the village of Popovka here. But after that, I'm like, okay, maybe it was just like some, countermeasures, there was just like, okay, because you could stroll into these border towns pretty easily. But the question isn't like if you took the village, it's like, does this have strategic importance? Is it on a high ground? Is it a big population center? So I'm like, I'm like, okay, Vostok fell, whatever. But then reports came in that the Russians completely captured the much bigger border town of Graborovsky here. This town, as you can see, if you scroll down here, this is a much more bigger town. This is where, taking it is a pretty decent size deal, and the Russians can accumulate actually forces here along in the other border town of Staroselya here, and then not only that, we actually had reports that the Russians have entered the village of Raznin. As you can see, this is another huge. Well, not huge in terms of villages and towns, and so now we don't have any updates of the Russians have taken this just yet. Some reports are saying the Russians are in Razny. Some reports are saying the Russians have been pushing towards the village of Taratuda here through these fields. So we need more. This just happened in the last 2 or 3 days at the end of this week. So we don't know if this is just going to be some small operation and it just stops here. But it just seemed like the Ukrainians were kept caught with their pants down, and there's actually a ton of civilians still living here. So yeah. So but yeah, the capture of Graborovsky is a very good jumping off point, and if the Russians take Razny, then this will actually start being very operationally significant. Right now, it's just a interesting tad bit. It could literally end, like by the end of we might never return to this front line ever again after this week. But it is interesting that they were able to take these two towns and also the forest between them, obviously. So yeah, one thing to look forward to is that the Russians are able to capture the village of Razny, and so forth. And if they were able to do that, then this will open up a lot of interesting things. Now, the thing is, I don't think the Russians intended this to be a big operation. I don't think they have a lot of troops here. By this time, the Ukrainians are going to start redeploying forces from their Sumy area to slow this down, and it'll just be a slow crawl again. If the Russians could take at least Razny, then they'll have a pretty decent and then this kind of lines up with their border, so there are probably some border patrol units here that could line up and protect the flanks here, just as the Russians could move along this rail line and support themselves here. So if they take Razny, it would be a small tactical success in this area. If they were going to expand this to become a bigger operation, then the goal would obviously be the district center of Krasnopelia. This will be a major goal for the Russians. The big thing I think I see for this is if they take Razny, then they're going to start pushing towards the village of Myrnohrad here and cut one of the main highways connecting Sumy and Kharkov. Now, obviously, this doesn't cut off them completely, but this does complicate logistics very thoroughly along the Sumy and Belgorod or Sumy-Kursk border. So I do think that if the Russians are going to expand this at all, they'll try to, and if you go down here, there's actually a river here that they could actually use. So yeah, the Ponisnya River. So they could take Mazinia, Slavhard, and use. And as you can see, there's nothing between the Russian positions in these villages and then whatever Ukrainians have in these small villages on the other side. So they could fortify this area and control the southern approaches from here. And then from here, the Russians will then be able to start advancing towards Krasnopelia, and then they'll probably have to open up a front here near Pokrovsk and try storming Krasnopelia from the north here. So I do think if this is going to be a bigger operation in Sumy, that the goal will be to take Krasnopelia, and from here this would not open up the eastern part of Sumy if they want to start trying to taking Krasnopelia this is the first step in trying to encircle Sumy, just as we were talking about how they were trying to encircle Sumy from the north here. So we shall see how that develops. A little bit more. There's been some small changes also in the traditional area when we talk about Sumy. The Russians are now stepping up the advances here after the Ukrainians pulled a lot of troops from the Sumy direction to reinforce Kupyansk and others. The biggest thing is that the Russians have reasserted control over Alexivka. They never lost control of it, but they're now fully back in control of it. We also are seeing them. They're trying to retake the village of Andriivka here. It's a small village. And and I think that a lot of sources are saying they're. I don't know if they've captured it just yet, but they're right now trying to reassert themselves here. Who knows? Maybe they could retake Kondrativka, a very big town which they lost during the Ukrainian counteroffensive here. But it's definitely possible for them to reassert the control over it. But yeah, some small gains here. Trying to retake some of these fields around Oleksivka and Drivka. So it looks like the Sumy bridgehead here for the Russians is now resecured. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kupyansk and Kharkov directions. Let's talk about Kupyansk here. The biggest thing is the Ukrainian counteroffensive into Kupyansk is continuously accelerating. We have more and more geolocations of the Ukrainians being, especially around this northern part. It seems like the Russian defenses in this northern area were completely destroyed almost. What we do know is that we had some geolocations of the Russians being in this kind of central part right here. It's kind of center part of Kupyansk, and we actually had we had some battles going on. For some sources are saying that the battles for this like micro district at the southern part of Kupyansk is still ongoing. So the Russians still have some positions in the southern part of Kupyansk, but the entire western part of Kupyansk, like the most western part, and then like the northern part has fallen to Ukrainian forces. I would say it's basically game over for the Russians here. Their supply lines to the north have been completely cut off. I still don't know if they've taken Kondrativka, but I'm almost certain because the loss of Kondrativka, there's only fields here. And I don't think the Russians have built any fortifications here. I do think the Ukrainians have a very good chance of taking back Globovka, Klinovo, and then the next hopefully for the Russians maybe they have some defenses around Zaporizhia here, but it's very much possible that the Ukrainians could push the Russians all the way back to Dorishnia. And then that would be very bad news. So I would recommend Russian command start building fortifications around Dorishny and Zaporizhia right now. But it's very, very precarious for the Russians right now. So we shall see if the Kupyansk thing is able to hold, but I don't think it will. So lots of the northern part has fallen, the southern the western part has fallen. So what the Russians can probably hold on to is the Kupyansk is split in half by the Osko River, so they could probably hold on to the eastern part. But with the western part being taken, they can't claim they've taken Kupyansk, and I don't think the Ukrainians aren't going to make the same mistake again, allowing the Russians to slowly just slide down the river and enter Kupyansk unopposed. They're going to reinforce Kupyansk, and it'll be a hard nut to crack. So I mentioned this before. I mentioned that the Russians had to expand their front, take a bunch, at least these villages here, have a bit of a buffer zone. So that when the Ukrainians do attack, you could hold off them. But it seems like that was pretty premature. So so when the Russians started making a lot of progress here, I'm like, okay, wow, the Ukrainians are really incompetent. But it seems like now the chickens have come home to roost. So I wouldn't be surprised that the Ukrainians recapture the western part of Kupyansk, and and so forth. And so then the question is if the Russians could hold on to their Dorishnya bridgehead. So we shall see how that develops there. And then a little bit more here. The Russians are still trying to battle for Petropavlovsk and Kucherivka, despite the claims of the former. They have not been completely taken. They have entered them, but they have not been taken just yet. Taking Petropavlovsk and Kucherivka will be actually a pretty good gain for the Russians. They could then use this to, secure their flank better and then continue pushing southwards, because then they have the Osko River to defend themselves, and I don't think the Ukrainians will be able to cross this, but I mean they can, but it'll be harder for logistics. So we shall see how that develops. But yeah, so very bad news for the Russians in Kupyansk. Now, where the Russians are making some more smaller successes around Volchansk, there's been some small progress here. The Russians are continuously pushing towards the town of Volchanska Khutoraya here. They've taken the western part of this town right here, taking this area right here. And right now, probably the main focus of resistance is these warehouses in the center part of Volchansk Khutoraya here. So if the Russians could take these warehouses, then this town will fall as well. So just the Russians are slowly but surely entering this town. They've also taken a few more of these tree lines that are to the south of Volchansk, just improving the buffer zone a little bit. They'll probably take more and more of these tree lines as the weeks go by, the days go by. Along with this, the main kind of clashes here are in Vilcha. Right now, the Russians took the south. They have taken the entire northern part, and this week they have taken the um, southeastern part. The only last part is the southwestern part here that remains under Ukrainian control, but it seems like the Ukrainian resistance here has been broken, and probably by the end of this year, the Russians will completely capture the town of Vilcha. So, yeah, and as I mentioned before, I think the Russians will continue pushing down along the Seversky Donetsk River here, probably take the village of Haravskia and Sinivka here, just, improve their, that'll be probably the next goal here. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians maybe pause here for a little bit, but we shall see, because the next Ukrainian big defense is around Bulyakolodaski, and there's only fields between Volchansk and that, and I don't think the Russians are gonna, move here, at least until the trees grow back and they can hide in the tree lines here. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, that's that direction. Now we're gonna go to let's go to the Pokrovsk direction, because that is also where the things are happening. So in the Pokrovsk direction, the main big sign is that the defense of Myrnohrad is completely collapsed. That right now, there's no organized resistance, according to most mappers, is that there's no like big Ukrainian defense node. It's a big fluid gray zone, and there's still Ukrainians held up in basements and such, but we're now in the tail end of the defense of Myrnohrad here. Most sources are saying the Russian, we had sources saying the town of Svetla has been captured. We had the Russians raising their flags all over the town of Svetla. We had the Russians being in the center part of Myrnohrad. So now we do also had bombings of Myrnohrad, particularly in this area. So we know the Ukrainians are held up in basements around the mine shaft, around this giant area with the high-rise buildings. So there's still Ukrainian resistance here. It's just that it's like in pockets. There's like a group of maybe 5 or 6 of them in a building, or and separate. There's no clear line of defense. So the entire Myrnohrad defense line has collapsed, and now it's just time to clear things up. So, it's hard to know as a mapper like where exactly is a full 100% control. It seems probably like this entire Myrnohrad area is probably a giant fluid zone. There's probably Russians all over here, but there's also probably Ukrainians, and it's just a matter of liquidate. Like, for example, the southern part's probably been almost completely liberated of Ukrainians, and now it's almost under full Russian control. But then as you move into the mostly center part of Myrnohrad, it's now being cleared. So there's probably still some Ukrainians. So right now this map shows that the center part has been cleared, but there's probably maybe some small groups of Ukrainian troops here. But it's very hard to know which is which. But we're just knowing that slowly but surely it's getting more clear, and the Myrnohrad's gonna be slowly taken. So yeah, the defenses of Myrnohrad are completely collapsing. Will have collapsed, and now it's just cleanup time. And we probably by the time of next update, we'll probably announce the liberation of Myrnohrad. A bit more to the west here, the Russians are making slow progress in the town of Grishna. They've taken more and more of this area right here, and just slowly but surely taking more and more of the southern part of Grishna and moving more and more towards the center. We had geolocation of the Russians being in this tree line around the rail line to the south of Grishna, so that looks like they are improving their positions around this area. We also had geolocation of the Russians being in the western part or the eastern part of Nova Pidora here, right here, and some sources are saying that the Russians have captured this entire eastern part of it, and that this entire area is becoming a more or bigger gray zone. So taking this will be a good step up for the Russians, having a small defense position in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast here. But I think the taking this is the purpose of this is to try to outflank Ukrainian positions that are all over these tree lines here, and try to improve the Russian positions in Novopalovka, and also just to protect their western defenses a bit more. So yeah, we shall see. The Russians are now battling for Nova Pidora, and we shall see if they're able to capture it. Russian sources are saying that the mine industrial zone has been captured by the Russians, but Ukrainian sources are countering that, saying they actually know that's not true, that they're still battling for it, but we don't have any geolocations either way. We had geolocation of the Russians being there. We didn't have geolocation of the Russians being like here, for example, or here. So we had geolocation basically of the Russians being here. So we don't know. We know it could be either way, but we just need more geolocation to confirm the exact location of what's happening for the Pokrovsk mine shaft. because taking it will be a very good boon for the Russians to put drone operators to start harassing Ukrainian logistics here. In the kind of like more Dnipropetrovsk area, the biggest news came that the Russians have completely captured the village of Sofivka, which makes sense. It's on the other side of the Kerensky Terets River. It's on the other side of these water reservoirs, so it was pretty isolated for the most part. So the Russians have captured it. I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians try to foil that by trying to send suicide squads from Turetsky into Sofivka by crossing the river. But right now, probably the Ukrainians just want to hold on to Turetsky and prevent the Russians from crossing the river there. So Sofivka has fallen. Very good news for the Russians. They probably needed to do that when they were in Kucherov Yar and all that. If they could take, because if they were still in Kucherov Yar, they could have tried to storm Turetsky as well, and then they could have had a very solid front line, kind of like this. Which is probably what they're going to aim to do now. They might stop here because right now their northern flank is pretty secure. They're still just improving a little bit. We had some geolocation of the Russians capturing some of these fields to the north of these kind of like rivers here. They look very blue. But anyway, and they're right now retaking the villages of Novoshakhova and Ivanovka. So, right now with Shakhova being their now center of resistance, they could probably hold on using some of these, fields and as like kind of the new northern flank. And, I don't think the Russians will push northern, at least now, maybe. But, if they want to obviously start storming towards Dnipropetrovsk, they need to start pushing towards this area again. And the main area of attack will be towards Kucherov Yar. Because then if they could take Kucherov Yar, even towards Zolotkolodaski like they did before, they could then take Turetsky. And then, obviously, the main goal here is to cut one of the main highways connecting Dnipropetrovsk and Drusovka. So the Russians are slowly but surely moving back north here, but because now their flanks are secure, they don't have to defend, and the troops getting freed up from Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad can now be focused on the flanks here. So, and they have like these logistics centers. So it'll be easier now, but, it's definitely the Ukrainians probably have a lot of troops here as well. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Huliaipole, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia directions. The biggest thing, let's talk about the battle for Huliaipole. The Russians are continuing dismantling the Ukrainian defenses in Huliaipole. The main news from this week came that the Russians completely captured the southern part of Huliaipole and captured a lot of these warehouses. There's also, as you know, because this has been a frontline town, there's a bunch of trenches to the south here, and the Russians are clearing these trenches up. And the biggest news is that the Russians have also entered the high-rise building area, or battling for these high-rise buildings in the southern part of Huliaipole. We also had, about a week or two ago, the Russians entering, crossing the river and taking some of these high-rise buildings in the more kind of center part of it. And then also, we had geolocation of the Russians crossing the river and harassing Ukrainian troops in the northern part, not in the central part, but in this like northern residential area. So we shall see how that develops. Right now the center of resistance is the center part, and we don't know how long the Ukrainians could hold on there. But it seems like even in the deep state, we're saying how the defenses of Huliaipole are being very much dismantled. So I wouldn't be surprised if Huliaipole falls within a week or two, and the Russians completely take the rest of this town. And then the next goal will obviously be the town of Zaporizhia here. So we shall see. But right now, Huliaipole is being dismantled. The Ukrainians are now back to their central center of resistance in this high-rise building areas in the center part of Huliaipole, but I wouldn't be surprised if it completely falls soon, because the Russians are already entering it, and it's only a matter of time before Huliaipole falls. So yeah, the southern part of Huliaipole has fallen, just like the eastern part and the northern part fell. Now it's just the center part that's left, really. So we shall see how the battle for Huliaipole continues. A bit more to the north, a lot of sources are saying the Russians are now creating bridgeheads on the other side of the Hansha River, which is where the Ukrainians built a bunch of trench lines. And right now, when you look here, for example, in Dnipropetrovsk, we had the Russians crossing the river and making a small bridgehead on the other side of the Hansha River. You might be wondering, well, these are just fields. There's not, how can the Russians hold on here? Well, there's a bunch of trenches that are actually lined up here, so there's probably a giant trench network that the Russians are using to hold positions here and to accumulate forces. Same thing with there being a small bridgehead happening here. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have taken the villages of Zaporizhia and Grasimovka here. At least the Russians are claiming that. These are a couple of no-name villages, really. Zaporizhia has a few houses. Yeah, there's like some houses. But anyway, so there's a small bridge happening here. So so there's a lot of trenches happening here as well. So if the Russians could accumulate forces in these two small bridgeheads happening, they could then slowly but surely expand out of them. Probably the biggest news here is probably reach this rail line. Is this a rail line or is this a? I think it's a rail line. Reach this rail line and try to. Right now, they're trying to surround the town of Myrnohrad here. So this is a major supply hub, a major defense node, and if the Russians can somehow enter it, maybe start, probably from here take the town of Borostovka, and then just start, reach, have this northern bridgehead, have this southern bridgehead, and then start storming Ternopil from the north and south, and they take it, then Ternopil will be the new center of Russian resistance here, and then that will break the defense line here, and then they could start, maybe attacking from the south towards Rizadivka and Vosodrivka here, and this could also come in tandem with, once the Russians take Huliaipole and Zaporizhia, they can then push northwards here, and then put the pressure on the south and north on this Ukrainian defense line here, and they could take all these big towns that serve as defenses for the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia direction. So lots of big news happening there. Also, there's other news is that we had geolocation of the Russians being in the western part of Ivanovka right here, so it does show that Ivanovka is probably still under Russian control. Maybe it's not as full control as, this map shows that it's a big gray zone, but I do think Ivanovka is still under Russian control, and the geolocation we got this week proves that, maybe there was a Ukrainian counterattack, but maybe they got pushed back, so so the battle for Ivanovka looks like it's still in Russian favor, and the Russians are still there, and they weren't kicked out. So a little bit good news for the Russians there. And then we're going to go kind of in the Zaporizhia direction as well. Just some more news happening here. The biggest news is that the Russians have made a lot of rapid progress towards the village of Lukisnia. I'm going to call this Leukemia here. We had geolocation of the Russians being right on the outskirts of Leukemia. We had the Russians being right in around the solar panel area right here. So, and we had the Russians making rapid progress from Kupyansk, taking a bunch of these tree lines between Stepova and Kupyansk. So a lot of rapid progress from Steppenhursk. I have not, last time we saw this is that they said the Russians has encircled the Ukrainian garrison in Steppenhursk here. But I'm kind of surprised they have not liquidated this yet. I'm expecting probably by the end of this year they'll take Steppenhursk, and then once Steppenhursk falls, they'll then start pushing towards Leukemia, and probably, be able to finally take it. And then, how big is Leukemia anyway? Is it a pretty decent sized? Yeah, it has actually some decent sized buildings here. So then, once they take Leukemia, they'll probably advance towards this. Is this even a place? Looks like a graveyard. Anyway, from there, the Russians, obviously the main goal for the Russians is to advance and break the Ukrainian defenses around these small villages here near Novoyanovka and Polavka and so forth. Probably also push towards Primorska to reach the canal here, which will be a very good northern defense line here. So probably the main goal for the Russians is to take Primorska and, kind of align the front kind of like this. And then from here, probably then advance towards to cut off Orekov, one of the main highways that connects Orekov to Zaporizhia city. And then by the time they do this, within like maybe 2-3 months or so, they're hoping that the Russian offensive from Zaporizhia, once they break this line, they'll then push towards this highway. I call this the Omelette highway because Omelette is one of the main towns here. But they'll try to cut this highway as the Russians cut here, and then the battle for Orekov will basically be that the group of forces Dnieper, which are focused here, and the group of forces east advancing here, will then encircle Orekov, take it, and then from here they'll then try to start trying to advance towards Zaporizhia city. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, that's that direction. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the areas that nothing really happened, the Kostyantynivka, Seversk, and Lyman directions. Let's talk about Kostyantynivka. The biggest changes is that the Russians have captured some more of these tree lines to the south of Stepanovka here. It looks like they're slowly but surely clearing up these trenches that are around the Kulybin-Belka pocket. Along with, we talked about the Russians are now clearing, this part of the Kulybin-Belka pocket. So it seems like slowly but surely the Russians are taking more and more positions. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing a giant storm towards Berostok and Stepanovka, which will, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians try to storm and take these two villages around Kostyantynivka soon. So some small changes around the fields here. So we shall see how that develops. And then in the Seversk direction, the biggest news is the Russians have completely captured the village of Svatovo-Pokrovsky. Not only have they actually taken it, they actually took the main defense trenches that are to the north of it. So this is actually what's important. It's on the elevated hill, and it's where the fortified area is. So the Russians taking that allow them to take Svatovo-Pokrovsky. The next town will be the village of Reznikivka. So right now it seems like as we speak, the Russians are bombarding and trying to take the the hills that have the fortified trench lines to the north of Reznikivka. So we shall see how the Russians are able to take that, and then once they do that, they'll be able to take this town here as well. Along with this, the Russians are now entering the battle for Sakikna here. The Russians have entered the eastern part of this town, and it seems like once the Russians clear up Dubrova and Orozhina, the resistance in Zakipna will fall, and the Russians will be able to take this village. So it'll be a very good gain for the Russians here. But yeah, the Russians are now re-entering it, yeah, this is also in tandem with pushing the Ukrainians all the way back to Alexandrivka, which is the main goal for the Russian operation here. It seems like probably the main goal is to take Alexandrivka, reach the Donbass Canal here, and then from here they'll be able to start shelling Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, because then they'll be within artillery and drone range. But they're just trying to get as close as possible. I don't think there'll be a direct attack though, because there's a lot of fortifications in front of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. I should call this the Slavyansk direction actually, but anyway, because it's not Seversk anymore. Anyway. Also, some sources are saying the Russians are now storming towards the village of Bordornia here, and are trying to clear up these tree lines here, which makes sense. I have not seen any geolocation of this, and I actually haven't seen pro-Russian sources claiming that the town of Bordornia is being stormed and taken. But this map shows that, so just something to keep in mind. But so yeah, these I wouldn't be surprised also that once the Russians push towards Kurtaluka and Kalinivka, that they also clear up these trenches to the south here, and so start push towards Alexandrivka, which is the main goal here. And then in Lyman, no changes actually at all in the northern part. The only part is that the main clashes in Orozhina. We had geolocation of the Russians being in the northern part of Orozhina, around this area, taking a stronghold here. And then we also had so we know the Russians are in the northern part of Orozhina, and also we talked about the Russians still in Dubrova, but there's still no consolidation, so the battles for Dubrova and Orozhina are still ongoing. And that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates. The next update actually will be a bit unique. I'm actually going to do it on the 31st. So it'll be around Wednesday, I think. So it'll be Wednesday. I hope you guys enjoy that. It'll be kind of like an accumulation for the rest of the year. And yeah, and then I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Be sure to subscribe and like this video. So aim high and wander on.